本期视频是中国学者金刻羽4月18日在美国明尼阿波利斯威斯特敏斯特市政厅论坛上发表演讲的下半部分。演讲的题目是“中国超越社会主义和资本主义”。金刻羽在北京出生长大，他的父亲是前财政部长，现任亚投行行长的金立群。金刻羽14岁赴美求学，在哈佛大学获得学士、硕士、博士学位。现为伦敦政治经济学院经济学终身教授。我们看看他是怎么说的吧。
So there's still room for growth. Now, the second misunderstanding is about Chinese aspirations. Some in this country may think that China's sole goal is to overtake the US. Geez, that's a lot of responsibilities in the world. No, thank you. And no, not feasible. The daily preoccupation of the vast majority of Chinese today is still about putting food on their table and keeping their kids in school, not really having a dangerous obsession about America, really. It doesn't believe that worrying about America is actually going to solve its own problems, and the government needs to keep its own house in order. There's a lot of domestic challenges. And by the way, talking about aspirations, and we have an ethical theme in this series of talks, we're going to have to accept that there will be similar aspirations from India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the entire African continent. They are rising. They have huge aspirations to pedal their way to prosperity, and we'll have to need to deal with that too. They're going to start selling cheap goods to China, use its technology. And by the way, some of that is already happening as factories are moving to Southeast Asia en masse. The Chinese don't really have much time to talk about the Vietnamese stealing their jobs. We don't really hear about it in the newspapers. Instead, what they hear about is they should invest more in smart manufacturing, in uptooling, upskilling their workers, climbing up the value chain so they're not forever stuck and condemned to producing cheap goods. Climbing up the global value chain is what they're focused on. And maybe it's also another cultural thing to do. And again, culture and history is something, it's a theme in my book. I like to talk about it a little bit because I do think we kind of sometimes underestimate how important they are, and that contributes to some of the misunderstandings. But it's a cultural thing to do in China to turn a crisis into motivation. Now, speaking of President Biden's export controls on semiconductors, or kind of asking companies to break off ties with China or to stop selling to them, well, initially it didn't go down that well in China. But then they kind of just turned it into a positive attitude. It totally mobilized everybody. They whipped companies into shape. For the longest time, they were actually comfortably importing American chips, and now all of a sudden they have to start buying Chinese chips. And not because the Chinese government forced them to, but rather it's because of these policies from America. So, and in fact, they said, well, thank you for keeping us on our toes. There were huge accelerations in these domestic industries, and there was almost a national euphoria when they made breakthroughs in the chip industry. Small victories, but still small triumphs, and the Chinese people were pretty happy. They turned this around and said, oh, this is pretty positive. And by the way, President Biden, would you mind also sanctioning our national men's soccer team too? But thank you. Jokes aside, to look at the rise of African India, does China want to see that as a threat or opportunity? I actually really think they see it as an opportunity. And that rest of the world is coming. 90% of the people in the world still live in the developing countries, and they too have that kind of aspirations. And third, finally, the Chinese people, the misunderstandings, and the new generation. That's actually what I enjoy talking about the most. It's what gives me the most hope that we are going to do much better with a new generation, and that we're not actually headed on a collision course. The new generation, born after the one-child policy in the 1980s, I was among the first generation. I have lots of thoughts about it. I've done lots of research about it. It's a fascinating topic. They are radically different from my parents' age, going through huge vicissitudes, economic, psychological hardships in China during these turbulent times. The new generation, they love leisure, consuming, spending, money on clothes, traveling, entertainment, all of that. They even like to borrow to spend. We used to think about China as a big saver, saving so much and then flooding the world with capital and products. Well, this generation is different. They borrow, they spend. 85% of the consumer credit is actually accounted for by people under 35. One click on Alibaba's e-commerce website, you can borrow to buy lipstick. That's what college students do. I don't know who pays them back, maybe their parents, but anyway, they still love to borrow. The mentality has totally shifted. And despite what we think about the one-child policy, the dark sides, there were also some unintended consequences. For one, it seriously raised the status of Chinese women. Why? Because you used to educate your sons first before your daughters. And everybody now with a daughter pour all the resources into her, the modern Mulans of every family, right? And we see in the data that the gender gap completely closed in my generation for attainment in higher education. And in the data, among the business leaders, those born in the 1990s, 45% of the business leaders are women, compared to only 6% of those born in the 1970s, 60s, or 10% for those born in the 1970s. So it really accelerated the closing of the gender gap for China in this formerly very traditional Confucian society, way above what economic growth would have predicted in other countries. And moreover, this is a really open-minded generation. I've looked at lots of international surveys about them. They care about things like diversity, animal rights, social inequity. They feel more confident. The kind of factory workers that opted for 3 shifts a night back in those days, that's not in their generation. They're more relaxed, more chill. It's not a bad thing. They're not going to be working as hard, as tenacious, but they have a broader, perspective about life in general. And also, they communicate better. Many of them have been educated in this country. 1/3 of international students in this country are Chinese students. And 5 million visitors before the pandemic come to this country. They are fluent with the Western culture, the language, and they would be great ambassadors for China. And they connect much better with the Gen Zs around the world, and they are that bridge. And they're also very innovative. Now, this is again a fact. Despite what's happening between the two countries, I don't know if you noticed, but 4 out of the 5 of the most downloaded apps today are actually Chinese. I don't know if it will stay this way, but the new generation, they have much less of a culture divide and gap. And so, let me leave with this thought. Our great leader, Deng Xiaoping, who really pushed the country for reforms and opening up and really was the forefather of this miracle success, used to say about intractable problems, and we had many back in those days as well, let's leave it to the smarter, younger generation to figure it out. They're gonna sort it out. But at the same time, we still need to hold the world together for them to actually give them that chance. I don't think that on top of all the debt that we're going to throw at them or the dirtier planet, that we really want to add a more dangerous world on the cusp of collapse to the mix. So it's where places like this, forums like this, to offer this exchange, to get to know each other better, to reduce these misgivings that I think is so important. And it's really in this kind of country that such curiosity and openness for different views can actually take place. So I really thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for giving me and so many other students from China, from India, from Africa to learn from this country. And we can also expect that when the next global financial crisis comes around the corner, and I'm certainly sure it will, the two central banks in US and China, they're going to have to call each other up, right? That if there's ever a hope of realizing the green transition, we are going to need the cheapest, cleanest energy and technology, and a whole lot of investment and collaboration to make it happen. And everybody here is here to stay. Nobody is really going anywhere. We're here. So let's keep the people-to-people connection, keep the dialogues open, have some goodwill, and maybe even just start from small victories. And I believe over time, even more can be achieved. Thank you.